I had been looking forward to that hunting trip for months. It was late October of 2014 when I finally got the chance to get away from work and spend a week alone in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 34 then, living in a small apartment in the city, and I needed the quiet. I wanted nothing more than cold mornings, the smell of wet leaves, and the chance to sit in the woods with my rifle. A buddy of mine had told me about an old cabin his uncle used to use. A small one-room structure with a tin roof and a wood stove, tucked back near a logging road. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The drive out there was long. The last stretch was just a rough dirt track full of ruts and puddles. I had my old pickup bouncing along, and the forest seemed to swallow everything the farther I went. No phone signal, no lights, no sound except the engine. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, bleeding orange through the tree line. The cabin itself looked like something pulled straight out of another time. Weathered logs, a door that sagged on rusty hinges, and windows with cloudy glass. The roof was patched in places with sheets of metal. I cut the engine, and it was so quiet it felt like my ears were ringing. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood smoke and dampness. There was a small cot against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a rough table with 2 chairs. Mice had chewed holes in the corners, and there was a pile of split logs stacked against the wall. I swept the floor with my boot, set my gear down, and tried to settle in. That first night was uneventful. I built a small fire in the stove, ate a can of chili, and listened to the wind scratch through the trees until I fell asleep. The first morning, I woke to frost on the window. My breath puffed white in the cold air. I boiled some coffee on the stove, shouldered my rifle, and headed out before dawn. The woods were silent, just the crunch of frozen leaves under my boots. I stayed out most of the day, sitting by a clearing and waiting, but saw nothing except a few squirrels and a hawk. By the time I hiked back, the sun was down and the forest had that eerie stillness that always seems to come just before dark. It was on the second night that things started to feel wrong. I had been sitting at the table cleaning my rifle when I heard something outside. At first it was faint, like branches snapping far off in the woods. But then it got closer, deliberate, heavy. I froze, listening. I told myself it was probably a deer moving through, maybe even a bear. I went to the window, but the glass was so clouded and streaked with grime I could hardly see out. All I could make out was a shape moving between the trees, tall and slow. My stomach tightened. After a while, the noise stopped. I sat back down, told myself not to overthink it, but every sound after that set me on edge. A gust of wind against the siding, a branch falling from the roof. It all made me jump. I barely slept that night. The third day I hunted again, but my mind wasn't in it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking the tree line. I saw tracks in the mud near the cabin on my way back, larger than deer but not quite bare. The ground was too hard to make out detail, just the shape of a heavy boot. My chest went tight when I saw it. I hadn't seen another person since I left the road, and nobody should have been out here. I kept staring at that print until the hair stood up on my neck. That night, I locked the cabin door, even though it was just a flimsy latch. I put a chair under the handle too. The fire in the stove crackled, and I sat there in the dim light with my rifle leaned against my knee. I kept listening, waiting. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't in the distance. It was right outside. Slow, heavy steps circling the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the rifle so tight my knuckles ached. The steps stopped at the door. The wood creaked as if someone leaned against it. Then a long silence. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. After what felt like forever, the sound moved to the side of the cabin. Something scraped against the logs, like fingers dragging. Then it stopped again right under the window. I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just sat there, muscles burning, waiting for the glass to shatter. But it didn't. After a long while, the sound faded into the woods again. I don't think I slept more than 20 minutes the rest of the night. Every crack of the stove, every pop of the fire, I thought it was footsteps. When the gray light of morning finally came, I felt sick from exhaustion. I opened the door, and my stomach dropped. In the mud just outside were footprints. Human footprints. Big ones, leading from the trees, circling the cabin, stopping at the window, then trailing back into the woods. I wanted to leave right then, but my truck was parked almost half a mile away, down the logging road. If someone was out there, they could be anywhere between me and that truck. So I stayed. I told myself I'd pack up and go the next morning, once I had light for the whole trip. That day I didn't hunt. I sat in the cabin with my rifle across my lap, barely moving, listening for anything. As the sun went down, I kept the fire low. The cabin was mostly dark except for faint orange glow in the stove. My nerves were shot. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow steps in the leaves. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and decided I wasn't staying another minute. The night outside was pitch black, the kind of dark where your own breath feels loud. I forced myself to move fast but quiet, following the faint line of the path toward my truck. My boots crunched on the frost. Behind me, somewhere back in the trees, I heard it again. Footsteps.
Matking mine.
I froze. The sound froze too. I took another step. It followed. I didn't think anymore. I broke into a run, branches whipping my face, lungs burning from the cold. I could hear it behind me, heavier, closer, not even trying to be quiet now. I didn't look back. I just ran until my truck came into view, sitting crooked at the end of the track. I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropped them, and yanked the door open. The second I slammed it shut, something crashed in the trees behind me, close enough to rattle the brush. I turned the engine over, threw it in gear, and tore down that road without even turning on the headlights until I hit the main dirt road. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station an hour away, lit up like a beacon. I sat there in the cab, hands shaking on the wheel, trying to breathe. I didn't go back for my gear. I didn't even tell anyone the full story until years later. That cabin is probably still standing out there, rotting into the dirt. Someone else might come across it one day and think it's a good place to stay the night. But I know better. I never went back into those woods again. I had been driving for almost 3 hours when the road narrowed into a single strip of cracked pavement lined with trees so tall and thick that daylight seemed to vanish under their branches. My grandmother's cabin sat in the far northern part of Michigan, a place that hadn't seen many visitors in years. She was 84 and lived alone, stubborn in her ways, refusing to move closer to family. She told me she preferred the silence of the woods to the noise of towns. It was the middle of October 1997. The air cold enough that every breath I took outside turned white. The leaves had mostly fallen, carpeting the ground in orange and brown layers that muffled my footsteps when I finally parked my car at the dirt clearing near the cabin. The place looked smaller than I remembered, its wooden walls darker, damp with years of rain and snow. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the shutters had come loose and swung slowly back and forth in the wind. I hadn't heard from my grandmother in almost 3 weeks. Normally, she wrote letters. Her handwriting was shaky, sometimes hard to read, but she never skipped more than a week without mailing something. My mother worried, but I offered to drive out myself and check. I told myself maybe she'd just run out of stamps, or maybe she was angry over something. But as I got closer to the cabin, my chest felt tight. The first thing I noticed when I walked up the porch was the smell. It was faint but sharp, something sour and heavy that clung to the cold air. At first, I thought maybe an animal had died nearby. The woods were full of raccoons, deer, and stray dogs. But when I put my hand on the cabin door, the smell hit stronger, seeping through the cracks around the frame. The door wasn't locked, creaked open with a shove, and the inside air rolled out in a wave so thick it made me gag. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and stepped inside. The cabin looked almost exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. The old wood stove in the corner, the sagging couch with its faded plaid cover, the shelves lined with canned goods and jars of dried herbs. But dust coated everything, and the floorboards creaked like they hadn't been stepped on in weeks. A kettle sat on the stove, blackened at the bottom, untouched. I didn't see her at first. I walked past the main room toward the back where her bedroom was. The smell grew worse with each step, and by the time I pushed open the door, I knew what I'd find before I saw it. She was on the bed, lying on her side, still dressed in a wool sweater and a long skirt. Her body looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken into itself, skin pulled tight around her bones. The blanket was bunched near her legs like she had tried to pull it up but didn't have the strength. Her eyes were closed, her mouth slightly open. I froze in the doorway, my throat dry, my stomach twisting so hard I thought I'd throw up. For a long time I didn't move. My mind kept repeating that it wasn't real, that she was just asleep, but the smell filled the room, thick and sweet in the worst way, and I knew she had been dead for days, maybe even weeks. I forced myself to step inside. The floor creaked, and I felt like I was intruding, like I shouldn't be there. I wanted to run out and leave everything behind, but something in me kept me walking closer. I looked around the room. The curtains were drawn, shutting out most of the light, and the air felt damp, like the windows hadn't been opened in months. On the nightstand, there was a glass of water half full, cloudy with dust, and a Bible with its spine cracked. I stood next to the bed and looked down at her. Her face looked peaceful, but her hands were clenched tight against her chest. I noticed her fingernails were broken, jagged, as if she had been gripping something or scratching. I didn't want to imagine what her last moments were like. The silence pressed against me. I could hear the wind outside, faint, and the ticking of the old clock in the main room. But inside the bedroom it was heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I backed out slowly, my hands shaking. I didn't have a phone with me. Back then, I didn't carry one on trips like this, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I knew I'd have to drive back to town to call the sheriff, but I couldn't leave yet. Something kept me inside. I walked around the cabin, forcing myself to look at everything, like proof that I wasn't dreaming. The kitchen counter had crumbs scattered across it, a plate with dried food stuck to it. The sink was full of cloudy water, a dish towel stiff with mildew hanging over the side. On the table sat an envelope with my name written on it in her shaky handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before I finally picked it up. Inside was just a short note. She wrote that she wasn't feeling well, that she thought it was her time, and that she didn't want anyone worrying about her. She told me to take care of the cabin if I wanted, or let it go back to the woods if I didn't. Her words looked rushed, some letters trailing off like she had lost strength while writing. I folded the letter back into the envelope and set it down. My hands felt numb, my chest tight. The smell was everywhere, no matter where I stood. I opened a window, but the hinges were stiff and the glass rattled. Cold air rushed in, but it didn't help much. I kept thinking about how long she had been lying there, how nobody knew, how the woods just swallowed up time. She must have died alone, with no one to hear her breathing slow, no one to close her eyes. The thought sat heavy in me, like a stone pressing down. As the daylight started to fade, I realized I couldn't stay in the cabin overnight. The smell, the silence, the weight of it all, I couldn't take it. I stepped outside onto the porch and filled my lungs with cold, sharp air. The forest around me was still, the kind of quiet that made every rustle of leaves sound louder than it should. I locked the door behind me, even though there wasn't much point. The key was still under the loose board by the step where she always kept it. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the sky turn darker through the trees. I didn't want to leave her like that, but I knew I had no choice. When I finally got back into my car, I didn't turn the radio on. I drove in silence, the letter in my jacket pocket, the smell still clinging to me even though I had left the cabin miles behind. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. By the time I reached town and stopped at the sheriff's office, the night had fallen completely. I walked inside, and the warmth of the building hit me, but I didn't feel it. I told them what I had found, gave them the directions, and then sat there, numb, while they made their calls. In the days that followed, we buried her next to my grandfather in the small cemetery by the church. The cabin was left as it was, quiet and sinking deeper into the woods. I've thought about that day countless times since. Not the funeral, not the people who came and went with their words of comfort, but that moment in her bedroom when I saw her on the bed. That image stays with me. The silence, the smell, the stillness of her body. What unsettles me most isn't just that she died alone, but that life around her went on without noticing. The woods didn't care. The clock kept ticking. Days passed while she lay there, and nobody knew until I opened that door. That's what I carry with me still, the weight of how easy it is to disappear, even when you've lived a whole lifetime. I still remember the trip I took in the fall of 1998, when I was 26 years old. I had driven out to New Mexico for a short break from work, wanting some time away from people and the city. I rented a small cabin tucked in a dry, open stretch of land a few miles outside a small town. It wasn't a fancy place, just a one-room wooden cabin with a bed, a table, and an old wood stove. The owner told me it used to belong to his uncle and that hunters had used it over the years. The place was simple, but I liked that. I wanted quiet. The land around the cabin was flat but rough, full of low brush, dirt trails, and a few old cottonwood trees that grew near a dried-up creek bed. At night, it got cold, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the wood walls. The closest neighbor was probably 2 miles away. When I first got there, I thought it was perfect, away from everything, just how I wanted it. The first 2 days passed quietly. I spent most of my time walking the trails during the day, taking photos with my old film camera, and sitting on the porch at night. The air smelled different out there, dry and clean, carrying the scent of sage. At night, the stars spread across the sky in a way I had never seen in the city. But on the third night, things changed. I had gone to bed a little after 11. The air was still, the night was cold, and I had pulled 2 blankets over myself. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping, like something dragging along the dirt. At first, I thought it might have been the wind or an animal nosing around the cabin. The area had coyotes, rabbits, even the occasional stray dog. I laid there listening. The sound came again, slow, steady, not like a small animal scurrying but heavier, dragging. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to move, but I couldn't help it. I sat up in bed and held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped. For a long while, everything was quiet. I told myself it was nothing, probably a branch or the wind playing tricks. And eventually I forced myself back down, though I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. I saw tracks in the dirt, but they weren't clear. They looked like prints but smeared, as if someone or something had been moving slowly on all fours. My first thought was that it was a coyote, but the prints seemed too large, too uneven. Some were deep, others shallow, almost as if the weight shifted strangely. I crouched down and touched the dirt, but it crumbled in my hand. I told myself it didn't matter. That day, I hiked farther out than usual, keeping to the dry creek bed. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear much beyond the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stopped walking, it was like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. When I got back to the cabin before sunset, I double-checked the door and the single small window. I pushed the chair up under the handle, more for my own comfort than anything else. I made a small fire in the stove and sat in the quiet as the light faded outside. The night came down heavier than the ones before. Around midnight again, I woke up. This time, the sound was clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My throat went dry. The steps weren't quick, not like a coyote or dog. They were paced out, heavy, like someone barefoot walking in the dirt. I stayed completely still. The wood of the cabin creaked, not from wind, but from pressure, like someone leaning against the walls. I gripped the blanket so tightly my fingers hurt. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing, then starting again. After what felt like an hour, the noise faded into the distance. When the sun came up, I went outside again. My chest tightened when I saw the prints. They weren't animal tracks anymore. They looked like human footprints, long, narrow, but twisted in a way that made me sick to look at. Some were deep in the dirt, others barely pressed. They circled the cabin, trailing off into the brush. I thought about leaving that day, but part of me told myself I was imagining things. I had rented the place for another 2 nights, and I didn't want to drive hours back just because I'd scared myself. I told myself it was someone messing around, maybe kids from town. I tried to convince myself it was explainable. That evening, I sat on the porch until the sun disappeared. The air was colder than before, biting at my skin. The silence felt thicker. I went inside early, locked the door again, and pushed the chair up tight. I kept my flashlight beside the bed. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up again. This time, there were no footsteps. There was breathing, right outside the window. Slow, steady, heavy breathing, like someone standing still, waiting. My chest burned as I held my breath, praying it would stop. Then the breathing shifted, moving along the wall, scraping softly against the wood, then back again toward the window. I sat up and clutched the flashlight, but I couldn't move closer to the glass. I was too afraid of what I'd see. The sound lasted for hours. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me into shallow sleep because I woke again when the sky was faintly gray. The noises were gone. When I stepped outside at sunrise, my stomach dropped. In the dirt beneath the window, there were prints again. Human-shaped, but not right. The toes were too long, bent into the dirt like claws. Some of the tracks looked like they started as hands, then shifted into feet halfway across the ground. I stared until my skin crawled, then forced myself to go back inside. I didn't wait for my last night. I packed up everything as quickly as I could, threw it in the car, and didn't even look back at the cabin. The drive out was silent. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't stop for gas until I was nearly empty. I just drove until the land felt different, until I was closer to people again. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. It sounded insane even to me. I didn't want the looks or the questions. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw in the dirt. To this day, I can still picture those prints circling the cabin. I can still hear the sound of the breathing outside the window, patient and steady, like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. I've never gone back to New Mexico since then. I don't camp alone anymore either. And at night, when I wake up in the dark and hear a noise outside, I lie still and hold my breath, praying it's nothing, because I know now that sometimes it isn't the wind or an animal. Sometimes it's something else, something that watches and waits. I drove up the narrow dirt road that twisted between tall pine trees, the late afternoon sun already starting to dip low behind the ridges. The road hadn't been used in a long time, and I could feel the crunch of gravel under the tires of my truck as the woods swallowed me deeper inside. My hands were tight on the wheel. I wasn't sure why I had agreed to stay out here, in an old cabin I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't mine originally. It had belonged to a friend of my uncle back in the 80s. Now, after so much time, it was basically forgotten. Most of the family didn't even know it still stood. But I had gotten the idea in my head that I needed time away from everything. Away from work, people, noise. Just me, the woods, and quiet. The cabin sat in northern Colorado, tucked far off a state road near Walden. The place had no real address, just GPS coordinates. It was built in the 70s, small, single story, made of darkened logs that had seen too many winters. When I pulled up and cut the engine, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. My dog, Scout, sat up in the passenger seat, ears pricked. He's a German Shepherd mix, usually calm, but his body stiffened as he stared at the tree line. I told myself it was just the new smells of the forest getting to him. I hauled my gear inside. The door stuck a little before it gave way. Dust clung to everything. The smell of mildew hit me first. The cabin hadn't been aired out in years. Wooden floors creaked with every step. There was an old stone fireplace in the main room, cracked but still solid. The kitchen was just a counter, a sink that looked like it hadn't seen running water since Clinton was president, and a rusted propane stove. I set down my bags, unpacked some food, and tried to make the place feel livable. Scout padded around, sniffing every corner, his nails clicking against the floor. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I had a small fire going in the fireplace. I sat in a chair, ate a can of soup, and listened to the wood crackle. Scout lay near the fire, eyes half closed but ears always twitching. I tried to read a paperback I had brought, but the quiet outside kept pulling my attention. Every small sound, a twig breaking, a soft rustle in the brush, carried like it was just outside the door. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in the old bed, which sagged in the middle, Scout curled on the rug nearby. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Not the normal creak of trees or distant hoot of an owl. This was heavier. Footsteps in the dirt. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. Scout lifted his head, ears up, eyes fixed on the door. His body went rigid. He didn't bark, but the low rumble in his throat was enough to tell me he didn't like what he heard. The steps circled the cabin, crunching leaves, then silence, then crunching again. I stayed still, waiting, every muscle in my body tensed. Eventually, after what felt like half an hour, the sounds faded. I told myself it was maybe a deer, maybe an elk, but the steps hadn't sounded like hooves. They had been too steady, too human. By morning, I convinced myself I had imagined most of it. Lack of sleep, old cabin noises. I made coffee on a camp stove I had brought and sat outside. The woods looked normal in daylight. A couple of squirrels darted between trees. Birds called from above. Still, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I saw them, tracks in the dirt. Not boots, not bare feet, but worn-down shoes. They came from the tree line, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the forest. Scout sniffed them too, his back hairs raised. I decided not to linger on it. I told myself maybe hunters, maybe hikers passing through. I pushed it out of my head and went about my day. I chopped some firewood, fixed a loose hinge on the door, and tried to keep busy. The second night was worse. Started the same, quiet, too quiet. Around 1 in the morning, Scout bolted upright. This time he barked once, sharp, then growled low. I sat up, heart racing. The footsteps came again, this time closer. They stopped right outside the cabin wall, maybe 2 feet from where I lay in bed. The boards of the wall groaned slightly, like someone leaned their weight against them. My chest tightened. I didn't move. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was nearly pitch dark. Then the doorknob rattled, just once, but enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Scout lunged toward the door, barking like mad, teeth bared. The rattling stopped. The footsteps retreated. I grabbed the old hunting rifle my uncle had left in the cabin decades ago. The thing was rusty but loaded. I sat with it across my lap until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I walked outside in daylight. The ground told the story I already knew. Fresh prints circling, stopping at the door, turning back toward the woods. I followed them 20 yards until they faded into the pine needles. Whoever it was, they were watching. The next day I considered packing up, but pride and stubbornness kept me. I thought maybe it was some drifter, someone curious about the cabin. If they wanted trouble, they would have tried harder to get in. Still, I didn't shake the unease. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair by the fire, rifle in hand, waiting. Hours crawled by. Around 3 in the morning, I heard them again. Steps closer, circling. Then a faint scrape against the back window. Not loud, just enough to know it was intentional. I aimed the rifle at the window, but I didn't move closer. The scraping stopped. Silence stretched out. Scout stood by the door, teeth bared, growling nonstop. Then came the sound of something being dragged across the porch. A slow, heavy drag, like wood against wood. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands hurt. After a long while, the sound faded into the distance. By sunrise, I opened the door to check. On the porch lay a long wooden branch, stripped of its bark, sharpened to a point at one end. It was placed across the doorframe like a warning. That was it. I knew I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't just curious. They wanted me scared, wanted me gone. Maybe worse. I didn't bother to pack neatly. I shoved my gear into bags, grabbed Scout, and loaded the truck. As I slammed the door shut, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The woods were silent, but I felt eyes on me, watching from the trees. I drove out fast, tires spitting gravel, heart pounding the whole way down that dirt road. I didn't stop until I hit the highway miles away. Only then did I breathe. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I heard from a local contact that squatters had been moving through that area of the forest, people living rough, avoiding town, sometimes aggressive. Maybe it was them. Maybe it was just one person who saw me alone out there and thought I'd be easy prey. Whatever the reason, I knew I made the right choice leaving. Some places, once they show you what's hiding in their silence, you don't give them a second chance. The cabin was small and old, tucked deep in the trees at the far end of a dirt road that didn't even show up on most maps. I had rented it for a few weeks because I wanted to get away from people and just be with my dog. His name was Ranger, a big mixed breed with short brown fur and a steady, quiet nature. He wasn't the type to bark much, but he always kept alert. It was the spring of 2011, and I was 34 at the time, looking for some peace after months of constant noise in the city. The place looked like it had been built decades earlier. The wood siding was cracked, the roof sagged in the middle, and the front steps gave a little whenever I put weight on them. The inside wasn't much better. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old smoke, like a fireplace that had been used too many winters without a proper cleaning. The furniture was simple and worn out. A crooked table, 2 rough chairs, and a couch with stuffing poking through the fabric. Still, the cabin had what I needed: shelter, quiet, and a spot where I could be alone. The nearest neighbor was nearly 2 miles down the same road, and after that it was nothing but forest and hills. Cell service was poor, and the radio in the corner barely picked up any stations. That was fine with me. I wanted silence. The first few days were uneventful. Ranger and I spent time hiking the trails, collecting firewood, and sitting by the lake that was just past the tree line. The water was cold and clear, and Ranger liked splashing along the edges while I sat on the bank with a book. At night, I'd light the fireplace, listen to the crackle of the wood, and hear the wind moving through the trees. It was exactly what I thought I needed. On the fourth night, things started to feel different. The wind had picked up, and the cabin groaned every time a gust hit it. I lay on the couch, wrapped in an old blanket, while Ranger curled up near the door. I was almost asleep when I heard him lift his head. He didn't growl or bark, but he stared at the window, ears stiff, eyes fixed. His breathing slowed, as if he was holding it. I sat up and followed his gaze, but outside the window was just black. I brushed it off as him reacting to the storm. The wind made the branches scrape against the siding, and it could have been that. Still, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening to the cabin creak, watching Ranger shift and lift his head every so often, always looking toward the same side of the house. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the rain, soft enough to show prints. I found deer tracks near the tree line, some raccoon prints closer to the shed, and then something else. Human boot prints, not mine, circling around the cabin. They weren't fresh from that morning, but the rain hadn't washed them away completely. Someone had been walking around the cabin during the storm. My stomach tightened when I realized the prints led up to the windows and then around to the back door. I told myself maybe it was a hunter who had gotten lost, or maybe some local just wandering. But the thought of someone being that close while I slept made the air feel heavier. Ranger sniffed the prints, then gave a low sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, but close. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I didn't want to hike far into the woods. I split wood, carried water from the lake, tried to keep busy, but every so often I caught myself glancing at the trees, half expecting someone to be standing there watching. Ranger was restless too. He paced near the door, ears turning toward the forest as if he could hear things I couldn't. By evening, I had worked myself into a state where I couldn't relax. I set a chair near the window where I could see the path, and I kept my flashlight and the axe I had used for chopping wood within reach. The fireplace gave off just enough light to cast shadows across the walls, and every creak of the cabin made me sit up straighter. Around midnight, Ranger started growling low in his throat. He walked to the window, stood stiff, and let out a single sharp bark. I froze, my hand tightening around the axe handle. Outside, between the trees, I saw movement. A shadow that wasn't shaped like an animal, taller, slower. I kept staring, but the darkness made it impossible to tell for sure. Then it was gone, swallowed by the black tree line. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the chair, flashlight in one hand, axe in the other, waiting for something to happen. Ranger lay by the door, awake and watching. The silence pressed in hard, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch outside. When dawn finally came, I went out again. More boot prints, fresh this time. They circled again, coming right up to the windows. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in, but they had been close, too close. I considered leaving that morning, but the thought of walking the 2 miles to my truck and finding the road empty made me hesitate. If someone was out there, I didn't want to be caught in the open. I decided to wait one more night, pack everything up, and head out early the next morning. That last night was the hardest. I didn't light the fire, didn't want to give away where I was. I sat in the dark with Ranger, listening. Hours dragged by. Around midnight again, Ranger stiffened. His growl was deeper this time, teeth showing, hackles raised. Then I heard it too. Slow, heavy steps outside, moving along the porch. The old wood creaked under the weight. My chest pounded so hard it hurt. I gripped the axe, aimed the flashlight toward the sound, but I didn't turn it on. The steps moved to the side of the cabin, then around to the back door. The handle rattled once, metal scraping against wood. Ranger lunged at the door, barking so hard the walls shook. The sound outside stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Minutes passed, long and empty. No more steps, no more sounds. Whoever it was had left. At first light, I packed up everything I could carry. I left the rest behind. I kept the axe in my hand the entire time. Ranger stayed close, ears still twitching at every sound. When we stepped onto the dirt road, I felt like I was walking out of a trap. My truck was still there, untouched, and I drove away without looking back. Later that day, when I finally had phone service, I called the local sheriff's office. They said they would send someone to check, but they also said it wasn't unusual. Hunters, drifters, even people living rough out in the woods sometimes came near cabins. But I knew it wasn't just a random wanderer. Whoever was out there had circled that cabin more than once, waiting, watching. Even now, years later, I think about it sometimes at night when I'm lying awake. The image of those boot prints in the mud, leading right up to the window where I had been sitting, keeps coming back. And I know the only reason they didn't try harder to come in that last night was Ranger. If he hadn't been there, it might have ended differently. That cabin was the last time I ever stayed alone in a place that isolated. I still take Ranger with me everywhere because I don't trust the silence anymore. The woods aren't empty, not really. Someone is always watching when you think you're alone. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a trip alone into the backwoods of northern Montana. I was 31 years old, working a job that kept me indoors too much, and I wanted space, silence, and something away from people. I had saved enough vacation days to spend 2 weeks out there. I rented an old cabin deep in the woods, about 20 miles away from the nearest small town. The owner lived down south and only came up once or twice a year, so he didn't mind renting it cheap. The cabin itself sat about a quarter mile off a narrow dirt road that twisted between tall pines and ridges of stone. When I first saw it, it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was dark, weathered from rain and snow, and the porch sagged a little to the left. There was a small chimney, a metal roof that popped and groaned under the sun, and a wide clearing around it where the grass grew waist-high. There was no electricity, only a gas lamp inside, a wood stove for heat, and a hand pump outside for water. It felt like stepping back decades in time. I spent the first 2 days settling in, chopping some firewood, airing out the musty smell, and taking long walks into the forest with only a compass and a map. I kept to myself, hearing nothing but birds, wind, and the occasional snap of deer moving through the brush. At night, I sat on the porch and listened to the insects hum and the woods slowly go quiet. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own heartbeat. On the third night, I started to notice small things. They weren't dramatic, just enough to pull at the edge of my mind. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise outside. It was steady, almost like someone dragging something across gravel. The cabin had no curtains, so I stayed still on the cot, staring into the dark. The moonlight was bright enough to see the outline of trees through the windows. The sound went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving around. I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found something strange. About 20 feet from the porch, the grass was pressed down in a wide, rough patch. It wasn't like deer tracks or anything I knew. It looked as if someone had stood there for a long time, walking in slow circles until the ground flattened. I stared at it for a while, uneasy, but I told myself maybe it was just elk bedding down. Still, when I went walking later that day, I carried the axe with me. By the fourth night, I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. I was sitting by the stove, reading with the gas lamp burning low, when I heard the sound again. This time it wasn't dragging. It was more like the crunch of footsteps in the grass. Slow, deliberate, one at a time. They moved around the cabin, stopping near the window, then circling to the back. My chest tightened. I sat completely still, holding my breath, my eyes locked on the dark glass panes. After a while, the sounds faded away into the distance. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I searched the clearing. I found footprints in the dirt, faint but clear enough. They weren't boots and they weren't bare feet either. They looked like someone had wrapped cloth around their soles, leaving soft impressions with no detail. My skin prickled all over. Whoever it was, they didn't want to leave a trail. That day, I hiked out to the dirt road to see if maybe hunters or campers were nearby. But I didn't see anyone. No trucks, no campsites, nothing. The road itself had no fresh tire marks. I realized that if anyone was moving around my cabin at night, they had to be on foot, coming through miles of woods. That thought made my stomach sink. The fifth night was worse. I barred the door with a thick piece of firewood and set the axe near the bed. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The woods outside seemed too quiet, as if even the crickets had gone still. Then the sound began again. Footsteps, slow and steady, circling. This time they didn't fade away. They stayed close, stopping right outside the wall near where I lay. I could hear faint breathing through the cracks of the logs. My throat was dry, my chest heavy. Whoever it was stood there for a long time. Minutes, maybe half an hour. I didn't move a muscle. Finally, the sound retreated back into the trees. When daylight came, I walked the clearing and found more of those soft, wrapped prints. This time they led off into the woods in a crooked trail. I followed them for a while, but the deeper I went, the more they vanished into thick brush. My nerves buzzed, and I turned back, not wanting to get lost. By then, I was counting the days until I could leave. But things didn't stop. The seventh night, I woke to the sound of the pump handle squeaking outside. Someone was drawing water. I stayed frozen on the cot, listening to the slow groan of metal. After that, the footsteps came again, closer, circling, stopping by the porch. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would give me away. I held the axe in both hands, sweat running down my back. The sounds went on until dawn. That morning, I packed my bag and decided I would hike out to the road and walk the 20 miles to town if I had to. But when I stepped outside, I found something on the porch. It was a piece of deer hide, cut roughly into a strip, still wet with blood. It was tied into a loose knot and left on the top step. My stomach flipped. That wasn't an animal. That was a message. I didn't even eat breakfast. I grabbed my gear and left the cabin, walking as fast as I could down the narrow road. I didn't look back. I walked for hours, sweat soaking through my shirt, every snapping branch behind me making me spin around with my axe raised. By late afternoon, I finally saw the town in the distance, the small gas station at the edge. My legs almost gave out. When I reached the station, I went inside and bought water, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the bottle. The cashier gave me a look but didn't ask questions. I didn't tell him anything either. I just sat outside until a bus came through and I climbed on. I never went back for the rest of my gear at the cabin. I never even contacted the owner again. It's been years since that trip, but I still think about those nights. I never saw a face, never heard a word, but I know someone was out there, watching me, circling that cabin night after night. Whoever they were, they didn't want me there. The strip of deer hide was their way of making it clear. I was lucky enough to leave before things got worse. I haven't gone camping alone since. Even now, when I hear something outside my house at night, I freeze up the same way I did in that cabin. The sound of slow footsteps in the grass still crawls up my spine, and I know I'll never forget it. I never planned to drive past her cabin again. After the divorce, I did everything I could to avoid that part of the county. I changed my routes, took longer ways around, and even avoided visiting old friends who lived nearby. But on that evening, late in the fall of 2006, the highway was shut down from an accident and the detour signs forced me down those winding back roads I hadn't touched in years. The sun had gone down earlier than I expected, the sky dark with low clouds, heavy with rain that never seemed to break. My windshield wipers squeaked across the glass, the steady rhythm almost hypnotic. The tires hummed against the wet asphalt. I didn't realize how close I was until I saw the bend in the road and felt a weight drop in my stomach. I knew this stretch by memory, every dip and turn. Her cabin wasn't far now. It sat off a gravel side road, tucked behind a thick line of pines. The kind of place you could drive past 100 times without noticing unless you knew it was there. I hadn't seen it in years, but the memory of it never left me. Nights spent in that place when we were younger, before everything between us soured. Now, just the thought of it made my chest tighten. I slowed the truck as I approached the turn. I told myself I wasn't going to look, that I'd keep my eyes straight on the road. But when I reached the spot where the trees opened up, my head turned almost on its own. The cabin was still there. It looked smaller than I remembered, crouched back in the shadows. The porch sagged at one corner, and the paint on the siding had peeled into strips. A single light glowed faintly through one of the windows, though I knew nobody had been living there for years. She moved out long after we split, when the place started falling apart and became more trouble than it was worth. The sight of that light froze me. I let off the gas, coasting slower, staring harder than I should have. Rain streaked the glass, and the light flickered once, as if from movement inside. My first thought was squatters or maybe someone using the place to get out of the storm. I drove on past, but the image gnawed at me. A light in a cabin that was supposed to be empty. I thought about calling someone, maybe the sheriff's office, but then I remembered how far out this road was. It could be hours before anyone checked, and by then whoever was there could be long gone. The rain came harder as I drove, hammering the roof of the truck. I gripped the wheel tighter, but my mind wasn't on the road anymore. It was on that faint yellow glow in the window. Every memory I had tied to that cabin came crawling back. Long nights of arguments, broken dishes, the silence that stretched between us until we couldn't take it anymore. That place never felt right, even when it was ours. About a mile down the road, I pulled over. My headlights cut across the wet pavement, steam rising from the exhaust. My pulse thudded in my ears. I told myself it was none of my business, that it wasn't my place to care what happened there anymore. But the thought of that single dim light sitting out there in the dark chewed at me like teeth. Before I could second-guess myself, I turned the truck around. The gravel crunched under my tires as I eased down the old drive. The trees crowded close, branches scraping the roof. I remembered this path too well. The tight bend that always washed out after rain. The patch of weeds that never seemed to die no matter how often we cleared it. The cabin came into view slowly. The porch sagged even worse than I thought. The shutters on the side window hung loose, clattering softly in the wind. But the light was still there, burning low and steady through the rain-smeared glass. I parked and cut the engine. For a while, I just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling motor, the storm pressing down. The air smelled of wet pine and mud. I felt like I had no business being there, but my body was already moving before my mind caught up. The ground squelched under my boots as I stepped out. The rain soaked through my jacket in seconds. My breath came out hard, clouding in the cold. Each step toward the porch felt heavier than the last. The closer I got, the more details I noticed. The porch railing was half rotted away, nails jutting out like teeth. The front door was shut, the handle dark with rust. And there, just behind the curtains of the lit window, I thought I saw a shadow shift. I froze, heart hammering. I waited, watching the window, but nothing moved again. My hands were trembling, and the rain dripped off the brim of my cap, running into my eyes. I told myself I'd just walk around to the back, make sure nobody had broken in, and then leave. Just a quick look. The mud was deep on the side of the cabin. I slipped once, my hand scraping against the rough wood siding. The smell of rot was strong back there, mixed with wet leaves. The back door hung crooked on one hinge, the lock splintered long ago. I leaned closer, trying to see inside through the crack. The air that drifted out smelled stale, like mold and old wood. It was quiet, except for the drumming rain and the wind in the trees. That's when I heard it. A sharp scrape like wood dragging across the floor. Slow, deliberate. I stepped back, pulse racing. I stared at that broken door, half expecting it to swing open, but it stayed still. The sound didn't come again. Only the storm filled the silence. I stood there for what felt like minutes before I forced myself to move. I went back the way I came, boots sliding in the mud. By the time I reached the truck, I was soaked through, my clothes heavy and cold. I didn't look back at the cabin as I climbed inside. When the engine roared to life, relief washed over me. I backed out fast, gravel spitting under the tires. The headlights cut through the trees, and for a brief second, I saw the cabin one last time in the mirror. The light in the window was gone. I drove until the trees gave way to open fields, until the cabin was miles behind me. My knuckles stayed white on the wheel, and I didn't ease my grip until I hit the main road again. I never told anyone what I saw or what I thought I heard. Maybe it was squatters. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes and ears. But I knew what I felt standing out there in the rain. That thick heaviness in my chest, the certainty that I shouldn't have been there. I never drove that road again. And even now, years later, I still see that faint yellow glow in my head whenever the rain comes down hard. I still wonder if someone was in there, moving through those dark rooms, or if the cabin itself just holds on to shadows long after everyone leaves. Either way, I know one thing for certain. I was right to leave that place behind, and I won't ever go back. The cabin I worked in as a park ranger was small and plain. Nothing fancy, just a box of wood with a slanted roof that creaked when the wind pushed through the trees. It sat at the edge of a clearing in the northern part of the state forest, far from the main station, meant for rangers like me who pulled night shifts to watch over remote areas. It was 1998, late September, the season when nights got longer and the air had that sharp bite that came before winter. I was 29, and this was my third year on the job. I thought I was used to being alone in the woods, but that night reminded me that there are things more unsettling than silence. The cabin had one room with a cot in the corner, a wood stove, a desk stacked with maps, and a battery-powered radio that worked when it wanted to. The door didn't lock well, the window frames rattled, and the floorboards were uneven. Still, it was shelter, and after hiking 10 miles up rough trails to get there, it was always a relief to drop my gear on the floor and sit down. That night, the sun had set fast. The clouds rolled in thick and gray, and by the time I made it inside, rain was tapping on the tin roof. I lit the lantern on the desk, fed the stove a couple pieces of wood, and tried to settle in. My job was simple. Check the area for signs of campers, poachers, or anything out of place, and stay put until morning. I was scheduled for 2 nights up there before hiking back down. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but even routine nights had a way of twisting on you when you were out there by yourself with no one around for miles. Around 9, I went outside for a smoke. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the air smelled like wet pine and mud. My boots sank into the soft ground as I walked a few steps from the cabin. The forest was dark, heavy, the kind where you couldn't tell how far the trees went. Even the beam of my flashlight didn't seem to reach far. It was the kind of dark that made your skin itch. I flicked the cigarette into a puddle and went back inside, shaking the water off my jacket. An hour later, I started hearing it. At first, I thought it was just the rain dripping from the roof, but then it came again. This steady crunching sound, like someone walking slow and heavy across wet leaves. My first thought was deer. The forest was full of them, and I'd seen them come close to cabins before. I turned off the lantern and pressed my face to the window. The mist made it hard to see anything, but I thought I caught a shape moving between the tree line and the clearing. No antlers, no real outline I could trust. I waited. The sound faded, then came again from a different angle. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Animals, maybe even a bear. I kept the lantern low and sat back at the desk, but the air inside felt heavier now, like the walls of the cabin weren't keeping much out. Every creak of the roof and pop from the stove sounded sharper. Close to midnight, I heard the cabin door handle rattle. Just one quick jerk, then stillness. My stomach tightened. I knew I had latched it, even though the latch wasn't much more than a bent piece of metal. I didn't move right away. I just sat and listened, barely breathing. The handle didn't move again, but I could hear the floor of the porch outside creak, as if someone had stepped on it. I grabbed my flashlight and unholstered the small revolver I carried on duty. I didn't like to think I'd ever need it, but regulations required it, and in that moment I was glad to have it in my hand. I didn't fling the door open. I stayed inside, waiting, light and gun aimed at the door. The sound stopped. Nothing moved. After maybe 10 minutes that felt like an hour, I lowered the light. I couldn't sleep after that. I kept pacing the cabin, checking the windows, trying to tell myself I was just wound up. I thought about the stories I'd heard from older rangers, about squatters hiding out in the woods, drifters, hunters who came in after hours. They always said the scariest thing out there wasn't the animals, it was people. That thought stuck to me like sweat. Around 2 in the morning, the noise started again. This time it wasn't walking, it was scraping. A dragging sound along the wall of the cabin, like someone was running a stick or a knife across the wood. Slow, steady, circling. I followed it with my ears, heart pounding, flashlight beam bouncing across the walls and ceiling. The sound moved along one side, then the back. I aimed at the window, half expecting a face to pop into the glass, but there was nothing, just the scrape and drag, then silence. I stayed awake until the first hint of gray showed in the window. My eyes burned, my hands shook, but the quiet of dawn felt like a rope pulling me back from the edge. I stepped outside to look for tracks. The ground was soft enough to hold impressions, and sure enough, I found them. Not deer, not bear. Boots, heavy ones. They circled the cabin, came right up to the porch, right to the door. I crouched down, tracing them with my eyes. They weren't my tracks. They were fresh. The worst part was the size of them. Bigger than mine, at least by 2 inches, deep enough in the mud to show weight behind them. Whoever it was had been close enough to touch the cabin walls, close enough to try the door. I didn't waste time. I packed my gear as fast as I could and radioed in when I got a signal on higher ground. They sent a team up later that day. By the time they got there, rain had washed most of the prints away. Nothing was left but a faint path leading back into the woods. No campsites, no gear, no signs of where they'd gone. Just vanished. When I finally got back down to the main station, my supervisor asked if I wanted to be reassigned. I told him yes. I didn't want that cabin anymore, not after what happened. I kept thinking about how easy it would have been for that door to give way, how thin those walls really were. People always imagine monsters in the woods, But I learned that night the real fear comes from not knowing who else might be out there, watching, waiting, deciding whether to step inside. Even now, years later, I still think about those boot prints circling the cabin in the dark. Whoever left them wasn't lost. They weren't wandering. They knew exactly where I was, and for some reason, they chose not to come in. That thought is the only thing that makes the story worse. Knowing it wasn't chance, it was choice. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, but by the time night came, it grew heavier, steady sheets drumming across the trees and turning the dirt trail into slick mud. I had been out there for most of the day, trying to put together something small enough to keep me dry for the night. It wasn't supposed to be anything big, just a little cabin. More like a box with a roof, something that would keep me from sleeping soaked through in the woods. It was 1994, early October, in the southern part of Oregon. I was 26 years old, broke, and too stubborn to go back to my small apartment in town after quitting a construction job earlier that week. I wanted to prove I could handle myself outdoors. I had been walking with a backpack of tools, nails, and a hatchet, trying to find a spot where I could build something temporary. I chose a clearing just inside the tree line, near a stretch of pines that shielded most of the wind. By the time I dragged enough branches and rough-cut logs into a pile, the rain had already soaked my jacket. My boots squelched with every step, mud sucking at the soles. I worked by the dull glow of a lantern, hammering together crooked walls. The sound of nails sinking into damp wood was drowned out by the constant roar of rain and the occasional snap of thunder somewhere far away. The cabin was nothing more than 4 uneven walls, patched with bark and branches. With a low roof I had to duck under to enter. The floor was just wet dirt covered with scattered pine needles. I had a small tarp stretched across one side to block the worst of the wind. It was ugly, unstable, but it was something. I told myself it was better than being in the open. Inside, it smelled like wet bark and iron from the nails. Water dripped steadily through the cracks, hitting the dirt with faint plopping sounds. I laid down my pack and sat against one of the walls, which shifted slightly under my weight. The lantern flickered weakly, throwing shaky shadows across the rough wood. I could hear the storm battering the roof above me, every gust of wind making the whole structure creak. My stomach growled, but all I had was a small bag of jerky and a half-empty bottle of water. I chewed slowly, listening to the rain pound harder, and that's when I started to notice the noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the storm. Branches snapping, water rushing down the slope behind the clearing. But then I heard something else, something that didn't fit with the rhythm of the weather. It was a dragging sound, faint but steady, like something being pulled across wet ground. I froze, the jerky still in my mouth, straining to hear past the rain. The dragging stopped. I sat there, telling myself it was probably a loose branch being pulled by the current. But the sound returned, closer this time, and with it came the crunch of footsteps in the mud. Human footsteps, heavy, uneven. I killed the lantern, plunging the small cabin into blackness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make no sound. The rain kept pouring, masking most noises, but the footsteps didn't stop. They circled, slow and deliberate, splashing through the puddles that had formed around the clearing. I thought about running, but the door was just a narrow gap I had left between 2 boards. If someone was out there, they'd see me leave. I waited, shivering as the wet cold sank through my clothes. Minutes dragged by. Then I heard it, something brushing against the cabin wall. A rough scrape of wood, followed by a faint thud. Whoever was out there touched the wall, maybe tested how sturdy it was. The whole frame shivered under the pressure. My throat went dry. The footsteps moved again, slow, pacing around the perimeter. I pictured a man out there, soaked through, watching, maybe waiting for me to come out. My hands trembled as I dug into my pack, pulling out the hatchet. The handle was slick with rainwater from earlier, but it was the only thing I had. The steps stopped at the door. For a long moment, there was nothing but rain and the hammering of my pulse. Then, sudden and sharp, a boot kicked the boards. The whole wall rattled, dirt falling from the roof into my hair. I gripped the hatchet tighter, ready for the boards to give in. But they didn't. The person outside stood there, breathing heavily. I couldn't see him, but I could hear the air being dragged in and out, uneven and strained. Then, just as sudden as it started, the noise stopped. No footsteps moved away. No dragging sound followed. Just silence and rain. I waited, afraid to breathe, my eyes straining in the dark. After what felt like an hour, I lit the lantern again, keeping it dim. The yellow glow revealed nothing but the wet wood and dirt floor. My arms ached from gripping the hatchet so tight. The storm went on. Couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, I imagined was him returning. I stared at the door until my eyes burned. By morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. My body was stiff and my clothes were still damp, but I forced myself outside. The clearing was a mess of mud and broken branches. Water had carved shallow streams through the ground. I turned to look at the cabin, and that's when I saw them.
Bootprints.
Clear, heavy, pressed deep into the mud, circling the cabin again and again. They stopped right at the door where I had heard the kick. The prints were large, at least a size 11 or 12. Too big to be mine. A long groove ran beside them, as if something had been dragged, cut through the mud in a line, leading back into the trees. I followed it with my eyes, but didn't dare step into the woods. The thought of finding out what he had been dragging made my stomach twist. I packed my things quickly, breaking down the cabin enough so it didn't look like anyone had stayed there. I didn't want to leave anything behind that might show I had been there. I slung my pack over my shoulder and left the clearing, not looking back until I was halfway down the trail. When I finally reached the road and the small town beyond it, I felt the weight of exhaustion crash into me. My hands were still shaking as I bought a coffee at a gas station and sat there, staring at the rain-soaked window. I thought about those footsteps, about the dragging sound in the mud. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to speak, hadn't tried to rob me. They had just circled, tested the walls, stood at the door breathing heavy. I never went back to that spot again. Even now, years later, when it rains hard at night, I still hear it. The dragging across the mud, the boots pacing just outside, circling in the dark, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. It was the summer of 1998 when I made one of the dumbest choices of my life. I was 23 at the time, restless, broke, and not really thinking about where I was heading. I had left college halfway through, was working odd jobs, and felt like I was drifting with no clear path. That was when I heard about an old caretaker's cabin sitting next to a forgotten graveyard just outside a small town in northern Kentucky. A guy I worked with at a warehouse mentioned it. He said the place had been empty for years, that the cemetery was hardly ever visited anymore, and that if I wanted to stay there for free, no one would notice. Free rent sounded better than scraping by in a beat-up car I sometimes slept in, so I went out there one humid July afternoon to see it for myself. The town was already small, just a handful of shops, a gas station, and a bar. A cracked two-lane road led out toward the hills, and after a few miles I saw the rusted sign for Everpine Cemetery, leaning sideways in tall weeds. The graveyard itself sat behind a broken fence, rows of crooked tombstones scattered across uneven ground. The grass was knee-high in some places, and it looked like no one had taken care of it in a decade. The cabin stood off to the side, maybe 50 yards away, tucked against a line of trees. It was small, one story, with a tin roof and a chimney that was crumbling at the top. The windows were clouded with grime, the door slightly warped, and the wood siding had gone soft in spots from years of rain. But it was still standing, and that was enough for me. I forced the door open with a hard push and stepped inside. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. There was one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a tiny back room that barely fit a cot. It wasn't much, but I told myself it would do. The first few nights were strange but quiet. I set up my sleeping bag in the back room, used a camping lantern for light, and cooked cheap food on a little propane stove. I kept telling myself that the cemetery didn't bother me, that I was too old to care about things like that. But every time I stepped outside at night to use the bathroom in the woods, I couldn't help looking at the rows of gravestones just beyond the fence line. The ground there always seemed darker than the rest, like the trees leaned in heavier over it. I tried to settle into some kind of routine. During the day, I walked into town to buy supplies or looked for short-term work. At night, I sat by the fireplace with a flashlight, reading paperbacks I picked up at thrift shops. The cabin creaked constantly, boards popping and shifting as the air cooled. I told myself it was normal, just the wood settling. But it was hard to ignore how loud it got sometimes, almost like footsteps shifting across the floor. By the end of the first week, I started noticing small things that didn't make sense. One morning, I found the back door cracked open when I was sure I had shut it the night before. Another time, I woke up to find my lantern sitting on the fireplace mantle instead of the floor where I had left it. I blamed it on my own forgetfulness, maybe on being too tired. But the more it happened, the more unsettled I felt. Then there were the noises, not inside, but outside near the graveyard. I would be lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the cicadas and crickets, when I'd hear something heavy moving through the grass. Not a squirrel or a rabbit, but something larger, slower, like a person walking. The first time I heard it, I sat up and held my breath until it stopped. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a stray dog, but it came back night after night, always around the same time, somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The humidity clung to my skin, and the smell of wet soil filled my nose. I swept the beam across the cemetery. The light caught the pale edges of gravestones, weeds swaying, tree branches stretching low. For a second, I thought I saw movement deeper in, a dark shape slipping behind a stone. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. Then the night went still, too still, as if every insect had gone quiet at once. I backed slowly into the cabin and locked the door. After that, I hardly slept. The following morning, I checked the ground near the fence. The soil was soft from a storm that had passed, and I saw impressions in the mud. They weren't animal prints. They were too long, too narrow, like the outline of boots. The steps led from the woods into the graveyard, weaving between the stones, then back toward the tree line. None of them came toward the cabin, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. Someone was out there at night, walking among the graves. I thought about leaving then, but I didn't. Part of me was stubborn, unwilling to give up the only free roof I had. Part of me didn't want to admit I was scared, so I stayed. The next week was worse. The sounds outside grew bolder. Instead of distant steps, I started hearing them closer, sometimes circling the cabin. The boards on the porch creaked once while I sat frozen in the dark, too afraid to move. Another night, I swore I heard breathing just outside the back window. Slow, steady, drawn-out breaths, as if someone was standing there, waiting. I stopped, leaving the cabin after sunset. I kept a kitchen knife next to my sleeping bag, even though I knew it wouldn't help much. Every little sound made me jump. The nights stretched on endlessly, my nerves wound tight. Then came the night I finally saw it. It was late, close to 1 in the morning. I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling, when the footsteps started again. Slow, dragging, crunching across the gravel and dirt near the graveyard. I held my breath and listened. They grew louder, moving toward the cabin. The boards on the porch groaned under the weight. My chest felt like it might burst from the pounding of my heart. And then, through the thin crack of the warped front door, I saw movement. A sliver of light from my lantern caught the outline of a figure standing there. Tall, thin, shoulders slouched forward. I could only see part of it through the gap, but I'll never forget the shape of the head turning slightly, as if listening. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The figure stood there for what felt like forever. Then the boards creaked again as it stepped back, slowly, and the sound of its footsteps drifted away, back toward the graveyard. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I had already made up my mind. I packed my things, stuffed them into an old backpack, and walked out. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I cut across the road and kept walking until I reached town. I never went back. Years later, I still think about those weeks. I don't know who it was out there, or why they came to the graveyard night after night. Maybe it was some drifter like me, maybe someone living out in the woods, or maybe something worse. Someone who enjoyed being near graves, enjoyed watching. Whatever the case, I know I was lucky. If I had opened that door, if I had stepped outside at the wrong time, I might not be here to write this down. The cabin is probably gone by now, rotted into the ground. But the memory isn't. I still see that sliver of shadow in the doorway every time I close my eyes too long in the dark. And that's why I'll never go near another graveyard again. I never really planned to stop at that place. It just happened. I was driving through the back roads of northern Michigan in late October of 1996. I was 28 back then, trying to save some money after quitting a dead-end job in the city. I had an old Chevy truck, a little rusty around the edges, but it ran well enough. I was taking the long way around, through stretches of forest that felt like they went on forever, just to clear my head. I didn't care much where I was going. I just wanted to be away from the noise of everything I had left behind. The weather wasn't bad, but the air had that bite to it, the kind that sneaks under your jacket even if the sun is still out. The trees were almost bare, with only a few orange leaves clinging to branches. Most of the ground was covered with damp leaves that stuck to your boots when you walked. I had a small cooler in the truck, a sleeping bag, and a half-baked idea that I might camp somewhere before heading back. I came around a bend in the road, and there it was, set back maybe 100 yards into the woods, almost swallowed by the trees. It was an old cabin, gray from years of weather, roof sagging a little in the middle. The windows were dark, half covered with grime. No path led to it anymore, just a faint line of trampled ground that might have been a driveway once. I don't know why I pulled over. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet. I sat in the truck for a few minutes, staring at it. My gut told me it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, I found myself grabbing a flashlight from the glove box and walking toward it. The crunch of the leaves under my boots sounded too loud, like the woods were holding their breath. The closer I got, the more I saw. The cabin's door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. The boards on the walls were split and warped from rain and snow. There was no glass left in the windows, just shards around the edges. I pushed on the door with my shoulder, and it creaked open like something out of a bad movie. The smell hit me first. A mix of damp wood, old smoke, and something sour, like rot. Inside, the air felt heavier. Dust floated in the beam of my flashlight. The floor was covered with leaves and dirt that had blown in through the broken windows. A few pieces of furniture still stood. There was a table with one leg braced by a stack of wood. A couple of chairs leaned against the wall, their backs cracked. In the corner, There was a rusted old wood stove with its door hanging open. It didn't feel haunted. It just felt abandoned, like time had been eating away at it, slow and steady. But something about it made the hair on my arms stand up. I walked through the single room, careful with every step because the floor groaned under my weight. There was a small door in the back that led to what must have been a bedroom. Inside, there was a mattress collapsed in the middle, the springs sticking up like broken ribs. A torn blanket was still on top of it. I stood there longer than I should have. My flashlight beam landed on scratches carved into the wood near the window. They weren't words, not anything clear, just lines and marks, like someone had dragged a knife back and forth. The edges were blackened, maybe burned. I felt my chest tighten, though I told myself it was nothing, just some bored kid messing around years ago. The silence pressed in hard. No birds, no wind through the trees. Even my breathing felt too loud. I backed out into the main room, shining the light again over the table. That's when I noticed something I had missed. There were jars lined up along the shelf above the stove. The glass was coated with dust, but inside each one was something dark, floating in cloudy water. I leaned closer. Some looked like animal bones, maybe small birds, maybe just scraps of wood. I couldn't be sure. My stomach twisted. I decided then that I had seen enough. I turned to leave, but something made me pause. Near the door on the floor was a pair of boots. Old leather, cracked, but not crumbled. They didn't look like they had been sitting there for decades. They looked like they had been left not too long ago. That feeling in my gut got worse. I stepped outside fast, my boots crunching hard on the leaves. I glanced at my truck, sitting there on the edge of the road, and then back at the woods. The trees looked different now, darker, like they had closed in around me while I was inside. I started walking faster, then broke into a half jog. When I reached the truck, I climbed in quick and locked the doors out of instinct. My chest felt tight, my palms slick on the steering wheel. I told myself it was fine, just an old cabin, nothing more. But when I looked back, I saw something that made my stomach flip. The door I had pushed open was now shut. I know I hadn't closed it. I hadn't touched it after walking out. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard they hurt. I sat there staring for what felt like minutes. The woods stayed quiet, no sound at all. Then I started the truck, the engine louder than I had ever heard it before, and I drove. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station about 30 miles down the road. My nerves were shot, and I sat there for a long time, just breathing and staring at nothing. I never told anyone about it, not really. I didn't want people thinking I was making it up or letting my imagination run wild. Years later, when I was older, I went looking on old county records out of curiosity. That stretch of land was listed as private property, owned by a man named Harold Price back in the 70s. He had moved out, apparently, after his son disappeared while hunting in those woods. Nobody bought the land after. It just sat there. I still don't know who closed that door. Maybe someone had been living in that cabin, coming and going without anyone knowing. Maybe they had been inside the whole time I was looking around, watching me. Or maybe it was just the wind, though it didn't feel like the wind. What I do know is that I'll never forget that silence, that heavy air inside the cabin, and those boots by the door. I still think about them sometimes, and every time I do, I feel that same twist in my stomach. That old cabin is still out there, rotting deeper into the woods, and I'll never go back. I was 26 when I decided to take a week off and drive north into the woods of Minnesota. It was the middle of October in 1998, cold but not yet winter. I had rented a small cabin off an old dirt road, several miles away from the nearest town. The listing made it sound peaceful. No neighbors, no noise, just a wood stove, a cot, a hand pump for water, and plenty of trees all around. At that point in my life, I thought I needed quiet, away from people and routine. I figured a cabin in the woods would help me think clearly, maybe even reset myself a little. The place was smaller than I imagined when I pulled up in my old pickup. A single-room cabin with gray, weathered boards, a sagging roofline, and a rusted chimney poking up crookedly from the back. The front door stuck when I tried to open it, but with a little shove I got inside. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and the whole room smelled of damp wood, ash, and something faintly sour, like old food. The furniture was simple. One cot, a small wooden table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a window on each wall, though the glass was cloudy and streaked with grime. The first 2 days went quietly. I spent my time chopping firewood, walking the trails that wound deeper into the woods, and scribbling notes in a small notebook I carried everywhere. The air was cool and dry, and at night I could hear the wind rushing through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch snapping somewhere out in the dark. Nothing unusual. By the 3rd night, though, things started to feel different. I had gone to bed around 10, laying on the cot with the fire dying down in the stove. Sometime past midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me, but the silence inside the cabin felt heavy, too complete. Then I heard its soft footsteps outside, on the dirt and dead leaves. They moved slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I froze on the cot, barely breathing, straining to listen. The steps crunched close to the back wall, paused, then shifted toward the front. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling while my heartbeat pounded in my ears. Whoever it was didn't try the door or knock, just kept walking, circling, until finally the sound faded away into the trees. I sat there awake until dawn, my body stiff and my throat dry. The next day, I told myself it must have been a deer or maybe just my imagination. The woods can play tricks when you're half asleep. I tried to shake it off and kept busy, but I couldn't help glancing at the windows more often, checking the tree line. That night, the footsteps came again. This time earlier, maybe around 11. I had kept the lantern burning low, and when I heard the crunch of leaves outside, my stomach sank. The sound circled the cabin just like before, steady, deliberate. I moved quietly to the table, grabbed the small hunting knife I had brought with me, and waited. At one point, the footsteps stopped right outside the front window. I stared at the dark glass, unable to see anything beyond the faint reflection of the room. My palms were sweating so much I almost dropped the knife. After a long silence, the footsteps started again, drifting toward the back of the cabin before fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every little creak of the cabin made me jump. By the 5th day, I was worn down from the lack of sleep. My nerves were shot, my hands shook when I tried to make coffee, and I kept thinking I saw shapes moving between the trees. I considered leaving early, but the nearest gas station was 15 miles back down the dirt road, and the idea of driving it in the dark made me hesitate. I told myself I'd leave the next morning, first thing. That evening, I stacked the fire higher than usual, wanting as much light as I could get. I double-checked the door latch and propped one of the chairs against it. Not that it would hold much. I sat at the table with the lantern and tried to write in my notebook, but my hand shook too badly to get more than a few words down. Then the sound came again. Footsteps, this time heavier, closer, not circling at first, just coming straight toward the cabin from the woods. I set down the pen and gripped the knife again, every muscle in my body tensed. The steps reached the front porch. The boards creaked under the weight. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then went still. I held my breath so hard my chest ached. For what felt like forever, there was only silence. Then, a slow dragging sound moved across the porch, like someone was running their hand or something heavier along the wood. After that, nothing. just the wind outside and the crackle of the fire. I didn't dare sleep. I stayed in the chair all night, staring at the door until my eyes burned. At first light, I packed everything I could into my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice trying to unlock the door. The dirt road back out of the woods felt endless, my eyes flicking to the tree line every few seconds, convinced something was watching. When I finally reached the main highway, I pulled over and just sat in the cab for a long time, my whole body trembling. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I told a man at the gas station what happened, he said the place had a reputation. Hunters who rented it often left early, claiming they heard someone moving around at night. No one had ever been caught, no tracks found, no reason given. Just the same story year after year. Looking back now, I don't think it was an animal. Animals don't circle a cabin night after night. They don't rattle doorknobs or drag something across a porch. Someone was out there watching me. Maybe they were waiting for me to open the door, or for me to step outside. Maybe they were just playing a game, seeing how far they could push me before I broke. I'll never know, but I do know one thing. I left that place alive because I didn't step outside, and I didn't open the door. And that's the memory that still wakes me up sometimes, even all these years later. Not the sound of the footsteps, not even the rattling doorknob. Just the thought of what might have happened if I had been curious enough or tired enough to find out who was really there. I was 32 when I spent that fallout at the farm in southern Kentucky. It wasn't my land. It belonged to a man I barely knew who let me stay there as long as I helped mend fences and kept watch over the property. The farm was more than 200 acres of rough pasture and thin woods, and the only real shelter besides the old barn was a one-room cabin that had been built back in the 50s. It was rough but solid. A tin roof, a wood stove, and a narrow porch that looked out toward the lower fields. I came there because I wanted time away from town, away from people. I thought the quiet would settle me, maybe get my head straight. Most days it did. But nights were different. The cabin sat about half a mile off a dirt road. The driveway nothing more than 2 ruts running through grass and clay. At night it was pitch dark. No nearby houses, no yard light, just the stars and the sound of crickets and owls. I had no electricity except a small generator I ran only when I needed to charge my phone or use a light. Mostly I kept to lanterns and a flashlight. Felt old, but I liked that. The first weeks passed without trouble. I split wood, patched holes in the barn, and walked the fence lines with a hammer and pliers. The fields were empty except for weeds and old hay bales rotting under the sun. I cooked simple meals on the stove, drank instant coffee, and sat out on the porch to watch the evenings roll in. But one night in early October, something happened that didn't sit right. I was lying in bed, my cot pushed against the far wall of the cabin, when I heard a truck out on the road. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then the engine slowed and stopped. It was close. I lay still, listening. Then the sound of a door opening, gravel crunching. After a minute, the engine started again and rolled off into the distance. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone pulled over to check a map or make a call. But it stuck in my head. Nobody had any business stopping out here at night. There was nothing around. 2 nights later, just past midnight, I heard something again. This time it wasn't a truck. It was a low thud from outside, followed by another. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and stood by the door. My heart was beating hard, and I tried to listen past the pounding in my ears. I thought it could be a branch falling or maybe an animal rooting near the porch. When I opened the door, the beam of my light swept across the yard. The grass shone pale under the moon, the fence line a dark cut against the sky. Nothing moved. I walked out a few steps, scanning the barn and the tree line, but I didn't see anything. Still, I could feel it, The sense of being watched, like eyes were on me from somewhere in the dark. I went back inside and pushed the chair up against the door. The next day, I found footprints near the barn. They weren't mine. The mud was soft from rain, and the tracks led around the side where the old doors hung crooked. The prints were deep, heavier than mine, and wide apart like someone tall had walked fast. I didn't like it. I kept checking the tree line while I worked, expecting to see someone step out, but it stayed quiet. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound jumpy. I just made sure to keep the axe inside and my flashlight close at night. About a week later, I was out by the back field cutting some fallen branches when I noticed something strange. At the far end of the fence, where the posts leaned against the woods, there was a small piece of cloth caught on the wire. I walked over and saw it was part of a shirt sleeve, torn and faded blue. It hadn't been there before. The edges were frayed but fresh, not old or rotted. Someone had come through the fence. That night, I barely slept. Every snap of a twig outside set me up straight in bed. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the crunch of gravel on the drive again. I didn't turn on the light this time. I just stood by the window, peering through the crack in the curtain. Headlights glowed faintly between the trees but didn't come closer. They shut off after a minute, then nothing. The silence after was worse than the noise. I waited, muscles tight, until the sky finally began to lighten. By the end of October, I was a wreck. I kept the lantern low at night, afraid it would make me a target. I moved quietly around the cabin, never staying near the windows for long. I kept thinking about the footprints, the cloth, the truck. It was clear enough. Somebody was coming around the farm at night, and it wasn't by accident. The final night I stayed there is burned into me. It was cold, the kind of chill that seeps through the cracks in the cabin walls. I had the stove burning but sat fully dressed on the cot, boots on, waiting. I didn't know for what. The woods were quiet, no wind, no night animals, just still, too still. Then I heard it, the creak of the porch boards under weight. Slow, measured steps, not a raccoon or stray dog. Heavy, human. I froze. The lantern was out. Only the faint glow of the stove lit the room. I reached for the axe by the bed and held it tight, my hands slick with sweat. Another step closer to the door. The sound of someone trying the handle, gentle but steady, as if testing if it was locked. I stayed silent, every muscle locked, hardly breathing. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. Then the door rattled under a sudden shove. The chair braced against it held, but the cabin walls shook with the force. For what felt like forever, the sound went on, the door straining, the wood groaning. I gripped the axe tighter, ready for it to break. But then, all at once, it stopped. Silence again, thick and heavy. Minutes crawled by. I stood in the dark, still listening. Then I caught the faint sound of boots on the porch steps, retreating. A moment later, gravel crunching, an engine turning over, the truck pulling away. I didn't wait until morning. I stuffed what little I had into my pack, left the stove to die out, and walked down that long drive with the axe still in my hand. I didn't care about the fences or the barn anymore. I just knew I couldn't stay there another night. I never went back. When the landowner called a week later to ask why I'd left, I told him the truth, that someone had been out there, coming around night after night, trying to get in. He didn't argue. He just said he'd look into it. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. Maybe a thief, maybe something worse. But I still remember the weight of those steps on the porch, the sound of the handle turning in the dark. It wasn't a ghost story. It was real, too real. And it was enough to make sure I'll never spend another night alone in a cabin on a forgotten farm. I went out to the countryside in the United Kingdom during the autumn of 2014. I was 29 then, and I had been burned out from work, so I took a break from the city and rented a small cabin in Northumberland, not far from the Scottish border. The cabin was old, tucked behind thick trees, and not many people lived around there. The closest village was about 3 miles away, and even that wasn't much, just a few shops, a pub, and some scattered houses. I wanted quiet, and I got it. The silence there had weight to it. No traffic, no neighbors arguing through walls, no buzzing streetlights, just the wind moving through branches and the occasional crow. The cabin itself was rough. It had a stone base, timber walls that creaked when the air was damp, and a roof patched more than once with sheets of metal. The windows were old, thin glass with wooden frames that warped in the cold. Inside, it smelled of smoke and old pine. There was one main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen space, and a back room with a narrow bed. It was enough for me. I had packed canned food, bread, and a flask of water, and there was a stream nearby for fresh water if needed. The first 2 days passed without incident. I spent time walking in the woods, gathering firewood, and reading by the fire at night. The weather was gray most of the time, with light rain now and then, and mist sitting low over the hills. It had a lonely beauty to it, and I liked that. But on the third evening, something happened that I still can't fully shake. It was near dusk. I had gone out to bring in more logs before the night set in. The air was colder than the previous nights, and the wind carried a sharp bite. The trees swayed slowly, their branches knocking against each other. As I came back toward the cabin, carrying an armful of wood, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of trees. A woman. At first, I thought she was just someone out walking, maybe a local from the village. But then I noticed how still she was. She didn't move, not even when the wind pulled at her coat. Her clothing looked odd, dark, heavy, almost like something old-fashioned. Her hair was long, dark, and it hung down straight over her shoulders. I couldn't make out her face clearly, but I could see pale skin. She was just watching. I froze halfway to the cabin, the wood still in my arms. My first thought was that maybe she needed help, but something about the way she stood there, silent and unmoving, made me feel uneasy. After a long moment, I went inside quickly and set the wood down near the fireplace. When I glanced back out the window, she was gone. The rest of that night, I felt on edge. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder. I sat by the fire, listening to the wind, telling myself it was nothing, maybe just someone passing through. But in that remote place, who would be walking around the woods at dusk, dressed like that? The next morning, I tried to push it out of my mind. I went down to the stream, filled my flask, and took a long walk along one of the old paths. The woods there were dense, with moss-covered rocks and fallen branches. I didn't see anyone. When I got back, though, I noticed something odd. Near the clearing where I had seen her the night before, the grass was pressed down, as if someone had been standing there for a while. It wasn't just one mark. It was a patch, flattened, like heavy boots had stood there. That night, I decided to keep the lantern on instead of sitting in complete darkness. I was writing in a notebook when I thought I heard movement outside. It was faint at first, like leaves brushing together, but then it was clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My chest tightened. I didn't dare open the door, but I moved quietly to the window. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, in the corner of the clearing, there she was again. The same figure, same dark clothing, same stillness. This time, she was closer, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. I stepped back from the window quickly, heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. There was no phone signal in that area, no neighbors close by. All I could do was wait. I stayed awake for hours, watching the door, the windows, listening. Eventually, when I looked again, she was gone. By the fourth day, I was considering leaving. I told myself it might just be someone from the village who was curious, but the way she appeared and vanished didn't fit that. Still, I stayed. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was afraid. That evening, I made sure the door was locked, though the lock was nothing more than an old bolt. I built a strong fire and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling in my chest. But late that night, I woke to a sound I'll never forget. The door handle moving, slowly, softly, as if someone was testing it. I lay in bed, holding my breath, listening. The handle rattled once, twice, then stopped. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat up by the fire until dawn, waiting. When light finally came through the thin curtains, I went outside carefully. The ground by the door was disturbed, muddy footprints leading up to the step. They were small, narrow, shaped like a woman's boots. I knew then that it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been there trying to get inside. That morning, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had planned a week. I didn't care about losing money. I put everything back in my bag and carried it out to the small car I had rented. As I loaded it, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That was when I saw her again. She was standing at the far edge of the trees, half in shadow, half in light. She wasn't moving, but I knew she was watching me. My chest felt tight, and I got into the car quickly. I didn't look back again. I drove out of there as fast as the rough road would let me. When I reached the village, I stopped at the pub just to catch my breath. I thought about asking someone if they knew her, if they had seen her before, but something stopped me. Maybe I didn't want to sound like I was losing my mind, or maybe deep down I felt it was better not to ask. I never went back to that cabin. I never even drove near that area again. I don't know who that woman was or why she was out there, but I know what I saw. She was real. She was watching, and she wanted to get inside. Even now, years later, when I think of that trip, it isn't the silence of the woods or the damp smell of the cabin I remember first. It's the image of her, standing there at the edge of the trees, waiting,